Look forward to, we really welcome you here and thank you for joining us today to talk a little bit about ICS security and some of the latest news from the front, so to speak, and to talk a little bit about how do we separate a bit of the signal from the noise, shall we say. There is a lot going on in the threat landscape around OT or ICS cybersecurity. And so we're going to try and cut through a little bit of that using CISA's guidance as a guide to help think about what are some of the foundational elements that we can take to not get distracted every time there's a brand new alert or a new advisory or a new piece of threat intel out there, but instead to try to keep some level of progress going across a program. So as we dive in here today, just a quick introduction of myself. I'm John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve. Verve, I've been with the company for about 6 years now, a little over 5 years. Prior to that, I spent about 20 years of my career with McKinsey & Company, a management consulting firm, where I was a senior partner there, helping clients with digital transformations, a lot of things around this whole world of industrial technology and communications. Just by way of background of who Verve is and where we kind of come at this conversation. So Verve started about 30 years ago as a control systems integrator. So our team is control system engineers who were designing power plants and chemical refineries, et cetera, the control systems for those. About 15 years ago, we developed the first version of the Verve Security Center, which is our software platform to help clients mature their overall ICS or OT security. And then today, that continues. We've continued to push and develop that product. And then we also offer a range of security services that help our clients over time achieve that security maturity that they're looking for. And so when I talk today about what we're finding, our team is doing research on these risks, vulnerabilities, threats all the time. We're reviewing all of the advisories that are out there, but then we're trying to help our clients practically make a difference every day. And so we brought those two things together in the conversation for this morning. So quick summary of our discussion. We're going to talk about three broad things. First, industrial control systems or operational technology risks and the response to those risks can sometimes feel overwhelming. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's been going on in this space from a threat point of view. The good news is CISA has laid out a set of relatively practical, consistent recommendations. CISA being the United States' cybersecurity advisory group, and what their government's advisory group, and they've set out this pretty consistent set of themes, regardless of which alert comes out and which advisory, that continue to come back to the same core set of ideas. And so we're going to talk about that. And then finally, we're going to talk through, okay, based on that, how can organizations make meaningful improvements in their security without essentially, reacting to each one of these new things and finding themselves sort of chasing the shiny object, but instead keeping a direction to their programs. So just to start with, what's going on in the world of OT security? We've coined this term, the air raid, of what's happening to all of us that are dealing with operational technology. The last two and a half years has been pretty dramatic in the rise of threats in our environment, and frankly, the changes to which organizations are dealing with those threats. So first of all, attackers, right? We all can read the press, et cetera, but the fundamental shift here is we've gone from a world where operational technology was really, the concern was really around nation states, APTs, et cetera, to now where the largest concern is around ransomware. Commercial attackers have found the money pot that is industrial facilities, and they are taking advantage of it. And as a result, the attack patterns have increased pretty dramatically from 2 years ago. Number two, IT is now becoming a much greater part of the OT systems, and therefore bringing with it more of the risks that go along with that. Number three, regulation. Depending on where you are in the world, you're probably all feeling it to some extent. Here in the US, the TSA pipeline regulations, we do work in Saudi Arabia. The kingdom has just launched their ICS cybersecurity requirements. Chile has just adopted the NERC-CIP standard, which is similar to here in the US. So regulation is growing regardless of where you are in the world. We're all resource constrained. Vulnerabilities continue to grow, but staffing doesn't. And this is particularly important in the world of manufacturing or other type of distributed operating environments where in many cases, a control systems engineer is being asked to look at the security of their environment as well. And those folks are already overburdened. Access, obviously, we know, particularly through COVID, but even prior to that, the amount of remote access to these facilities was growing. Two big changes, insurers. So for those of you who haven't dived deep into the cyber insurance market, it has become quite expensive and very limited in what coverage you get. And what's happened is many of those insurers have suddenly discovered that actually OT is covered by their policies. And therefore, they're now putting much higher requirements on organizations to define what it is that they're doing from an OT or an ICS security standpoint. And then finally, directors. Directors are becoming much more involved in this. Boards are saying, this is becoming a significant risk and we really aren't protected there. So again, a bit of a simplistic moniker for this, but we tried to sort of make it memorable. But the reality is there's a lot of different things impacting our world of OT security. As I mentioned, a couple of notes around those risks. This is from the left-hand side is from actually both of these are from the SANS ICS survey that they do every 2 years. And the belief by practitioners, this is the survey of practitioners, is that the risk to OT has jumped dramatically over the past couple of years. And why is that? It's the right-hand side here. If you look at that ransomware or financially motivated attackers, it wasn't in the top 5 if you look 2 years ago. It was all APTs or adding new devices that may be risky to the network or internal. And now ransomware has jumped to over 50% of people saying it's the greatest threat vector. This is because of the fact that it's very, very profitable and hackers have discovered that. And at the same time, we're seeing all these alerts that emerge. And so our team analyzed the ICS-CERT advisories. So this is the team that gathers advisories from vulnerability advisories from control system vendors or third parties that publicly release these vulnerabilities. And if you look at the total number of advisories, they went up by about 30% in 2020 over 2019. They went up by another 30% last year, and they seem to be on pace when we look at the first 6 months of this year. By the way, what that means is not just 30%, but the total number is jumping quite a bit to keep that 30% pace going. Similarly, the number of CVEs is also growing, up by 700 or 1,000 depending on the year. And by CVEs, we mean the actual vulnerabilities themselves. So with each advisory, you can get multiple vulnerabilities based on how many products are affected or what the issues are with those products. And the average CVSS, or the average risk score of those vulnerabilities, is almost an 8 out of 10. In other words, it is a critical risk on average. And that's also gone up about 70% over the last couple of years. So what we have is a world where attackers, ransomware is more prevalent. And at the same time, we're seeing a pretty massive increase in the number of advisories and vulnerabilities that are specifically focused around the OT systems. And when you dive into those vulnerabilities and you look at, are they really risky or are they not risky? What you find is that, basically the skills needed to exploit these vulnerabilities are very low and are also exploitable remotely. And so when we think about, okay, is this a problem? How big of a deal are these vulnerabilities? The reality is they're a pretty big deal in the sense of how risky they are. Now, are there ways to protect yourself? Yes. Are there patches that could be applied? Yes. However, the vulnerabilities themselves, when they're first released, unless you do something about them, the idea is that the fact is that they are highly exploitable, and you don't have to be an insider to do that. When you then look and say, okay, those are the vulnerabilities specifically around ICS or OT devices. So think of a PLC or a controller, or maybe the application software provided by the OEM. All that's true. But you also have all of those traditional patches for the OS, for, I'll call it the more mundane software in your environment. And this is just a chart from an example. It's all sanitized, but basically showing how many missing critical patches that we would typically find when we look across a few sites. And this is pretty typical, right? For 3 sites, you're talking like 4,000 critical patches that have not been deployed. And we all know why, right? We all know the explanation for this, which is it's very hard. We have vendors who may not approve patches. We have needing outages or at least reboots of computers to deploy patches. Many of these patches are for embedded devices, which may or may not be able to be patched without an upgrade to the system. And so, we're already not very well patched. And now all of a sudden there's more vulnerabilities being poured on top. It can feel overwhelming, right? It can feel like the world is, I just can't keep up with what's happening. And so CISA has essentially responds to each one of these new vulnerabilities, right? Each one of these ICS-CERT advisories, CISA is going to have some recommendations, not to mention advisories around some of the threat actors. Recently, the Indestroyer 2 that was discovered in the Ukraine, and various other threat actors that are discovered, CISA will come out and make recommendations. And so what we try to do is say, okay, what are the experts, so to speak, telling us to do with all of these things? And so we just took a couple of these to try to lay out what are they suggesting. So in the top left, back in early part of this year, right after, well, actually just before Russia invaded the Ukraine, we had an alert come out called Shields Up. And this wasn't just specifically for ICS, but it was definitely focused on control systems as well. And their specific recommendations for Shields Up was basically 4 things: changing your default passwords, enforcing MFA, particularly for remote access, strengthening security of IT and OT networks, i.e. segmentation, and identifying some form of a resilience or recovery plan. Relatively straightforward. Now, there was a lot underneath that, but a relatively straightforward set of things. When we then look at a lot of these recent ICS-CERT advisories, shouldn't be ICE, it should be ICS-CERT advisories, again, a relatively focused set of recommendations: minimizing network exposure. So in other words, ensuring they're not accessible from the internet, locating them behind firewalls, when remote access is required, using secure methods, et cetera. And then overall, they'll tend to come back with a recommendations around impact analysis. And then they have a set of specific recommendations, which we're going to talk about. When we look at specific vulnerabilities, so recently there was a published vulnerability around Siemens WinCC. And again, they come back with the same basic recommendations around, do the impact analysis, look at our web page, et cetera. So, okay, what's there? What's in those web pages? What are we looking for? And so what we did is then we took, okay, let's look at what was the recommendation around this Indestroyer 2 malware. So for those of you who don't know, Indestroyer 1 was some pretty significant malware that was used in taking down the grid in Ukraine several years ago. Indestroyer 2 that was discovered again in the Ukraine, and right just before the Russian attack on Ukraine. And so there was a set of recommendations that came up. Isolating SCADA systems, using multi-factor, sounds familiar to the other ones. Incident response plan, again, sounds familiar. Changing passwords, sounds familiar. Then there were some specific things around ensuring OPC UA security, because that's one of the particular risks for that threat actor. But then ensuring you have backups, limiting the SCADA network connections, segmentation, protecting management systems largely through things like EDR, implementing log collection, and I can go on. The point is that when we read these things, it's not all about that particular threat. These are general principles around ICS or OT security. And when you look at these time after time after time, you get basically the same recommendations, maybe with a flavor here or there, but 80 to 90% are these same foundational elements. And so as we thought about this, it seems like we're in some ways chasing our tails, right? We see these alerts, and so we're now reacting to that alert and that alert and that alert. But when you come down and boil it all down, what are the experts recommending? The experts are recommending the same core fundamentals on almost all of these risks and threats that are out there. And so what are those? So from the CISA's website, these are the core fundamentals that they recommend. Having risk management and cybersecurity governance. Think of this as having a response and action plan in case of emergency. Having physical security. And then we get into the cyber things like ICS network architecture, perimeter architecture, host security, patching and EDR and things like that. Security monitoring, logging, that sort of thing. Ensuring your supply chains are secure, and then the human element of training and policies and procedures. These things are not that, it's not radical, right? These are not, new news. These are things that we've been talking about for a long time. And they're consistent, again, time and time again. In fact, if you looked at things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, if you look at the CIS top 18, if you look at IAC 62443, the themes are very similar as you go through those, as you go through these. And so I think what we're trying to say here is we can, in the US, we have this phrase of whack-a-mole. There's an old kids game where a mole would pop up out of a hole and you try and whack it with a hammer and the next one would pop up, et cetera. And oftentimes it feels like we're playing whack-a-mole, right? There's, okay, here's another ICS alert advisor. Here's another one. Here's another one. I think CISA has done a nice job of laying out a set of consistent plans and things we can execute against if we don't get distracted and try and play whack-a-mole or the shiny object. And so what we're going to try and do now is say, okay, based on that, based on those recommendations, what do we do? How do we make progress against that? And not, we certainly don't want to ignore new threats and new advisories, et cetera. They're important, but let's make sure we have a plan. So how do we build a plan and execute against those things that CISA has recommended? And so we've laid this out in 5 basic steps. The first is we follow a 3-phase approach to achieving this. Assess the environment, first-time remediation or catch up or fix the initial problems, and then maintain. Number 2, ensuring that when we're doing those assessments, we're assessing the comprehensive risk across all the elements. So as CISA recommends, right, there's not one thing, there's 6 or 7 or 8 things that we're supposed to focus on. Let's look at that comprehensive risk in one look so we can make the right prioritizations. Number 3, integrate our remediation efforts. We see a lot of people end up siloing remediation. So I'm going to have one group, they're going to do network segmentation. I got another group, they're doing backups. I have another group, they're doing policies and procedures. I have another group, they're trying to figure out how we're going to patch things. Our strong belief, recommendation based on experience is integrate those remediation efforts so you don't have 6 different teams trying to manage all of this. Number 4, consolidate the ongoing view of your risk status. Things change. As one of my colleagues likes to say, ICS-CERT rots over time because small changes get put in. A vendor comes in, has to add an account to do something on the system. Did we really manage that account, or now is there a new admin account created that we didn't monitor and manage? Just as one simple example. And then finally, think global, act local. What we mean by this is the only way we're going to be able to do this with the limited resources we have is if we aggregate that information into a visibility capability, so I can see everything with a small group of people. Meaning, if I've got plants all over the world, I get that data rolled up into a single console so I can analyze. But then when I want to go take remediating actions, those remediating actions are distributed to a local site, but the control system engineer is in control of taking those actions. Now we can hold them accountable because we can see centrally, but we're not patching a system from 2,000 miles away, not knowing if it's the right time, not having somebody on site to ensure that when that system reboots, it comes back online, et cetera. So those are 5 principles, and we're going to talk about each of those today. So let me first start with those 3 broad phases. So if we're going to go try and achieve those 8 things that CISA recommends, we first got to start with, let's understand where we are against that. And we tend to use the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's the simplest in terms of the frameworks to get our heads around. Obviously, IEC 62443 is very helpful to layer over this, but just for communication purposes, a lot of time to CSF is an easy way of communicating. But essentially assessing across the various layers. For instance, do I have policies around backup and incident response, et cetera? What's my patching current policy? And then really importantly, identifying my risks, in the network and at the endpoint level. So what hardware do I have? What firmware and software is installed on that? How many vulnerabilities do I have per the chart above? What's the network connectivity I have? Am I segmented or not? Oftentimes we'll find when we go into a client that they believe they're segmented, they've got firewalls. And then as we put in our software, we discover that, well, yes, you have the firewalls, but you also have a bunch of dual NIC machines that are going around the firewalls, et cetera. So really assessing that environment. That then leads to a set of remediation tasks. Often there's this sort of big hump, meaning, okay, boy, there's a lot of risks. So now I have to go through an initial wave of remediation and catch up with a lot of things that frankly we haven't been doing historically. But then what CISA is arguing and recommending is you have to maintain that over time because the threats are just going to keep coming, right? There's going to be new advisors, there's going to be new vulnerabilities, there's going to be new threat actors out there. And so by building a foundation of that initial remediation and then maintaining that over time, each new vulnerability isn't like I have to go chase my tail because I have a systematic way of looking at those vulnerabilities and attacking it. And so this 3-phase process is how we strongly recommend trying to build a consistent approach to achieving those CISA recommendations. The reality is, I'm sure we all live this, those of us in ICS, we start with a relatively insecure by design network and assets. So oftentimes there's shared passwords and there's logical reasons for that, right? We need to have operators be able to get into a device quickly in case of emergency. We've often got, third-party remote access, and it's oftentimes not really well managed because a vendor has to get in and deal with their systems. Or, I have a technician who in the middle of the night needs to be able to remote in. We've got old systems, XP, Windows 7, maybe NT, things like that. We've got dual homed NICs, as I mentioned, some of those frankly designed in by the vendors, right? The only way really to design a Delta V system, for instance, is to have dual NICs. Passwords are often standard and maybe default, may never be rotated, et cetera. In fact, recently there was a, recently as in last week, there was a new vulnerability set released by Verve Labs, and which is part of Forescout. And they listed 30 different vulnerabilities called ISPAL. And as you look at those vulnerabilities, Eric Byers, who is the former founder of Tofino, who's one of the really most experienced, well-known, well-respected people in the ICS cyber community, he came out with a note saying, or a comment in an article saying, this was a really poorly done job. And the reason for it is many of those vulnerabilities that they identified were essentially designed into older products. If you had upgraded those products over time, you would have remediated those vulnerabilities. And so, but the reality is many people don't. And there wasn't really a way to solve a 20-year-old device problem other than remediating it through network segmentation, et cetera. And so as we think about how we're going to protect ourselves from some of these vulnerabilities that are out there, there's in most cases not a real way to patch it. And so we have to find compensating controls to many of the things that we see on this chart. So what do? We think about starting this with that assessment part. And if you look at what CISA is recommending, it largely correlates to the traditional quote unquote defense in depth model. And this is a simplified view of that. But if you look across those recommendations, right, we've got policies and procedures. This is everything from your human part of this, of change management, et cetera, but it also includes policies around backup procedures, et cetera, but then includes physical security policies and even supply chain policies. So looking at the policies and procedures, looking at our perimeter networks, how do we look in terms of connecting to the internet or not? Then on the ICS network, so once you're quote unquote inside that PCN firewall or that process control firewall, how is that networked? Is there segmentation, separation between different systems? Then access control, what CISA recommends is, controlled remote access, MFA, et cetera, but it also includes managing users and accounts and least privilege, et cetera. And then finally, all the way down to the host, those areas around patching, whitelisting, et cetera, and configuration hardening. And so to really get a handle on building that programmatic approach to CISA's recommendations, we would typically start with this sort of comprehensive risk assessment. The good news is you can do this through technology. We're not here to talk specifically about Verve's technology as much, but there are ways to use technology to gather this information without spending years and years in surveys and having to go to every site with people, but to actually use technology to do this. And to do that, endpoint and network visibility really form the foundation of that, right? You have to get to a view of the facts around your systems, getting that asset inventory, understanding accurate software and firmware. So one of the things that we find a lot of times when we talk to clients, they've got some inventory, it's in spreadsheets, et cetera, but do they know all the software that's on it? Do they even know all the hardware? Certainly the firmware versions, maybe not. And so ensuring that you've got a good picture of that then allows you to know if when that new vulnerability comes out, if you've got systems in your network that may be vulnerable to it. Physical port connections, so are those devices truly segmented physically or not, et cetera. And what this allows you to do by looking at the facts rather than just surveys, but actually looking at data, you can then make risk trade-offs. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. When we hear customers who we engage with who have kind of struggled in some of these things, oftentimes they've started with a network segmentation project. and it's 18 months in and it's not really going very well. And a lot of that comes back to a lack of visibility of what are we really trying to segment in the first place. You know, supposedly we've got security by vendors, by OEMs, but oftentimes those aren't really maintained by the folks at the plant. And oftentimes they're kind of left to the people at the plant to maintain, et cetera. Anyway, the point is, this fact-based approach allows you to start to get a real handle around where do you want to start that remediation process. And so the way we refer to this is a 360-degree view of your risks. It starts with that inventory. And then by gathering that inventory, you then can see, okay, what are the published vulnerabilities that exist on this? So I don't have to scan it. I don't have to, run Nessus and possibly trip my plant. By gathering that hardware and software inventory in the right way, I'll then know what vulnerabilities exist. I then can look at, okay, how many missing patches do I have? So great, I have a vulnerability. Have I deployed the patch? Did I not deploy the patch? Where am I in my patching cycle? Do I have configurations that are hardened? So one of the key recommendations in all of the CISA efforts is around, well, if I can't patch it, what can I do to secure that configuration? Whether it be a Windows device or an embedded device. User and account access risk. So do I have a lot of dormant accounts on my system? Are the passwords default passwords? Are they shared accounts, et cetera? What's my AV antivirus status? So oftentimes control systems come from the vendor with an AV tool deployed on them, let's say. Okay, but when's the last time I updated the signature of that? Have I been monitoring the alerts on that? If I have whitelisting, is it actually in lockdown mode, or is it more, I have it deployed on the system, but I haven't actually locked down any applications? What are my network protections? So reviewing firewall rules and ACLs and understanding traffic flows to know whether you have breaches in your network protections. Monitoring your backup and recovery status. So do I have updated backups for these systems or not? And then finally, asset criticality. What's the criticality of that? How important is that asset to my process? And by gathering this view, we can now start to prioritize. So against that CISA landscape of, okay, what are all of my risks? I can start to see, okay, which are the biggest problems for me? And I can start to prioritize limited resource. I also can think about compensating controls. So I may not be able to patch that device, but okay, is my antivirus up to date? Well, I can update the signatures on my antivirus. I can make sure that the configuration is locked down tight. I can make sure that I don't have any inappropriate users or admin rights that shouldn't be there. I can make sure that I've got a backup for that device in case something happens. So I can think about the holistic risk, and I can think about what compensating controls I could take to remediate that risk rather than just rely on patching. This is why, in our view, it's critical to get that holistic view of your risks up front so you can start to make the trade-offs of where to go next. And so when we think about that assessment, it starts with that inventory. I won't go into this in gory detail, but having an inventory of what are all of your OS vintages, having everything from embedded devices like PLCs and controllers and VFDs all the way to servers and switches, understanding the operational context of that system. So how important is it? And then calculating some form of a risk score based on all of that data. These are the kinds of things that help us drive to a better set of priorities. And software, right? Every time we do one of these tech-enabled assessments, we always find software that shouldn't be on a control system, whether it be TeamViewer or LogMeIn or things like that, or as crazy as CD burners. And oftentimes it's because there's no real standard secure configuration for OT devices. So anyway, just gathering that information, gathering your vulnerability data, making sure you've got that picture. And we'll provide this document for everyone after the meeting so you can see it. CISA also calls for things like looking for users and accounts that are misconfigured, or admin accounts that have expired passwords. How many administrator accounts do we have per host, right? Are we creating local admin accounts? Do we have a lot of inactive accounts? This is a big one, where threat actors can get in using inactive accounts that no one really thought to look for, but may cause us risks if someone found the password in some dark web site, et cetera. So again, just holistically looking at the various types of risks in the assets that you have. And so what then that comes back to is, again, back to the defense in depth. What are our gaps, right? What are our gaps? So we've got no knowledge or procedure to maintain network connectivity, let's say, no asset identification process. We've got endpoint risks like no accurate asset inventory, hundreds of missing critical patches, hundreds of critical vulnerabilities on PLCs, no log management or incident response at the endpoint, et cetera. And so we can start to lay this out across the enterprise and allow us to get a priority across those various CISA elements around where do we begin? What are the most important things to begin with? And so those remediation, basically in that assessment, will come back with remediation, and then it can align against the CISA recommendations, right? We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're not coming up with recommendations that are specific to one vulnerability or one threat actor or whatever. Instead, we're coming back with consistent recommendations that align to what, quote unquote, the experts are telling us to go pursue. And it allows for a much more consistent, programmatic, therefore, approach to going after it. And so taking that as our guide, we then can layer out a roadmap, right? We can go from one maturity level to another. By the way, this is completely made up in a way, right? It's going to be different, frankly, for each organization, but also even down to a site level, it may be different, right? So one manufacturing facility or one power plant or one gas terminal may be different than another in terms of what are the priorities, and then we can lay them out against those various elements of the recommendations. So at an endpoint level, right? Okay, that's the first thing to do. Let's patch those critical vulnerabilities that we can. Let's harden the configuration settings. These are things we can do without any new hardware, any new network segmentation. They're relatively, they're not costly other than from a labor point of view and potentially a downtime if we've got to take an outage to patch things. Then over time, we'll add more security as we add additional things. So maybe we don't have application whitelisting. So let's put that in and let's lock it down. We can start to monitor for indicators of threats using some form of endpoint detection. And then over time, there may be a much more robust segmentation approach, advanced incident response playbooks, et cetera. And so again, this allows us then, if we have this kind of a maturity program going, to react to those new ICS advisories because, okay, great. I've got a vulnerability and patch management program. So when that new vulnerability comes in, it's just going to feed right into that program. And I can manage that in the way that I'm managing all the rest of my vulnerabilities. And so going from that 360-degree risk assessment to actually executing risk reduction, right? So I've analyzed those 360-degree risks, and now I can go and I can patching, I can link it directly to the vulnerabilities. I can do that configuration hardening. I can ensure logging on the device. All of those things that I've identified at a risk, I can now go fix. And that's why our view is doing this assessment using a tech-enabled approach where you've got software in the system that's gathering this data, and that software then allows you to then take actions to remediate that risk. Our view is that's a great way to accelerate your overall program, because I'm not just manually going and assessing the risk and then coming back and trying to go figure out how I'm going to fix it all. Instead, I'm using the technology that eventually I'm going to use to remediate to actually do the assessment in the first place. And I can do that. I can start to prioritize things, right? I can look for specific risks. So what might be referred to as kind of brand name vulnerabilities, those that have been exploited heavily, the WannaCrys, the NotPetya's, the Blue Keeps, et cetera. Okay, great. I got specific assets with those commonly abused CVE families. And then I can prioritize my assets. So I've got a total number of vulnerabilities, but I'm going to drill down to the ones that don't have a compensating control. They're critical, but I don't have application whitelisting and I don't have a recent backup. Okay, I better get on patching those right away, as an example. And so I can take that remediation plan and make it very, very specific to a plant or to the enterprise to say, these are where I really need to focus right now. I'm going to skip over this one, it's given time. And then we can talk about segmentation, right? So we can see those network risks. We can see that, okay, I've got communications going between IT and OT. I've got no separation inside the DMZ, if there is a DMZ, by system. I've done my discovery, and what I find is that in the back plane of a PLC or a controller, oh wow, the vendor has put in a 5G or 4G card and they're communicating out to the internet. I see the dual home connectivity, et cetera. And so now I can put in place a programmatic segmentation effort, right? I can say, okay, I know the risks I need to address first. Some of those I can do right away without any new hardware, with just frankly programming of firewalls that I already have or switches that I already have. Others actually may require infrastructure. And so I can sequence out my risk reduction program to go after those things that are more near term and those things that may take us a little longer if we actually have to go acquire hardware and put new hardware in. But again, bringing this together with one remediation program, I'm thinking about the segmentation of the network as I'm thinking about the endpoints. And so I'm thinking about, okay, I've got these risks to my endpoints. What's the best way to address that from a network point of view and from an endpoint point of view in the same effort, rather than chasing a network team and then there's an endpoint team and then there's a vulnerability team, and oh, by the way, somebody else doing policies. Our view is doing that as a single effort is a much more effective way of going about it. And again, we'll send you this, but basically being able to leverage IT policies. So really, when you think about this, the maintenance, we sort of lay it out in this way of that asset inventory forms the foundation of the program. And it creates this machine, and it allows you to do vulnerability management, patch management, configuration management, all the way around to intrusion detection and incident response. And that system then allows us to achieve what CISA is looking for us to achieve, or recommending that we achieve, in a coherent, consistent manner, with all of that information integrated in one way, in one platform, so that we can make those trade-offs and make consistent programmatic progress, rather than, quote unquote, playing the whack-a-mole game I mentioned before. Look, the reality is that in IT, this is how people think about this, right? Is in an IT world, like over 3/4 of the tasks in cybersecurity are around systems management, if we think about it, right? So we often get, I shouldn't use a certain sidetrack. We often get excited maybe by the shiny object of big data and machine learning and AI and all this stuff. And that's what you need to do cybersecurity. And yeah, there's important parts of that, right? But when you look at this, right, only 9% of all of the jobs that we're talking about in cybersecurity, this is from the NIST database of jobs, only 9% really around the analysis stuff. 15% are really monitoring, investigation type skills. 3/4 are core systems management, right? Designing our architectures, ensuring when we provision new devices, they're configured appropriately, making sure we're patching and we're doing configurations, doing our vulnerability analysis and AV and whitelisting management, et cetera. The point is that we can get distracted by the stuff at the bottom of this page. Not that it's not important. I don't want to say that. It is important. It's a critical part of security. But we forget about the stuff at the top of this page. And in the world of OT and ICS, the stuff at the top of this page is our real problem. right? It's the things that will get us in trouble because we're not patched, we're not segmented. We don't see that device that's connected and wirelessly transmitting to the internet, et cetera. And so as we think about prioritizing our efforts, thinking about what we call OT systems management as a core part of that program allows us to ensure that we've got the right mix of priorities in this journey. Not that we should forget about the stuff at the bottom of this page, but that we just remember the balance and the importance of the stuff at the top. And when we do think about the monitoring type things, our view is you also have to bring all the data together, right? Is often what we find is we're really relegated in OT sometimes to that DPI, that packet inspection, network NIDS type of approach. If we're going to do monitoring, we got to take all these telemetry into effect. Logs, sys logs, configuration changes, device metrics, EDR, AV alerts, even process alarm data. There's a ton of information, process alarm data, that allows us to identify real threats. And yes, that should be put into some form of machine learning, automated threat hunting, et cetera. Our strong view is linking that. We link ours to MITRE ATT&CK. You can choose to do that, or you link to something else. The point is, though, bringing that data together so that we can see how these sets of information interact to drive a more complete picture of a threat coming down. And then lastly, I mentioned this notion of thinking global and acting local. So if we're going to achieve those CISA recommendations and be able to maintain them, the number one challenge that everyone has in this industry is resources. When you look at the various surveys that have been done over the past couple of years, number one, number two, number three reasons are all related to resourcing and talent. We cannot win this game if we're stuck with security that is only deliverable at a plant or at a location, whatever is your site, et cetera. We really can't live with it, even if it's within a division. So if I'm a power utility, I've got thermals, I've got hydro, I've got wind and solar, maybe renewables. Oh, by the way, then I've got T&D for electric, and maybe I have gas. I can't have individual silos for each of those. I just don't have the labor to, and I particularly don't have the labor to have a different approach for each OEM, right? So Honeywell has their way of doing it, Emerson has their. It's overwhelming. So our strong view is you got to centralize this. You got to get all that data up to the top so you can quote unquote think globally, meaning small team, every asset in your environment, every network in your environment in one database. That database showing you all of your risks, your remediation strategies, your status, et cetera. But then when you want to take an action, so, okay, I need to patch these vulnerabilities. The last thing you want to do is to have somebody at corporate who doesn't know the process, doesn't know their timing, doesn't know, when they can reboot a system, sending patches down and tripping the plant. And so this is where our architecture uses a thing called think global, act local. So when those actions are distributed, it is in the power of the control system engineer to take those actions. Now, we can monitor it centrally, but before that action is taken, somebody who has deep understanding of the process ensures that it's done safely, timely, et cetera. And so if we're, as we think about CISA's recommendations, there's a lot of things in there, right? There's host security, there's network security, there's perimeter, et cetera, et cetera. It's impossible if we're going to try and do that at a site level, or we're going to try and do that silo by silo. Okay, somebody's going to do network, we have to get that into an integrated visibility to have a small team be able to manage that. We just don't have the resources to do it another way. So just in summary again, if we go back to what CISA is recommending, those 8 things, let's not get distracted by the shiny objects. Yes, there's going to be new vulnerabilities. There's the icefall, and then there'll be some cutesy name to all of them. Nothing wrong with the names; they are memorable. But it's confusing, right? Because some name, you've got InDestroyer, but then other companies don't call InDestroyer, they call it something else. It's overwhelming, right? The good news is CISA does boil this stuff down, and it's consistent. It is consistent. We just have to focus on those elements. And then our recommendation is these 5 steps. This is what we've seen work with our clients. Following that 3-phase approach, assess it using our view is use technology to assess it that can then help you remediate it. But do that really robust 360-degree assessment. Integrate your remediation efforts. So put that plan together, but work as a team to go after those remediation efforts. 4, consolidating that risk view across all your assets and environments. And then finally, that idea of thinking global and acting local. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully it was a way to try and simplify a little bit some of the complexity that's out there with all of these vulnerabilities and threats. There were some questions that were submitted before we talked, so I'm going to try and address some of those. And then obviously, if you have questions, please drop it in the Q&A. We've got about 5 minutes or so left, and I'll try and answer those. So the first question was about where do you start? Hopefully, we addressed a little bit of that today. Our view is you start with that assessment. If you said, okay, look, I get it. So I've done the assessment. And I've got risks all over the place. Where do I begin to go after those risks? So we would think about that on 3 axes. So the first axis is, what are your most critical assets? Start your program focused on the most critical ones. That may be, by the way, a particular plant or group of plants. It may be a group of assets within a plant. But which ones are the most critical ones to you? Number 2 then is do the things that you can do without adding new infrastructure. Infrastructure, you all know this, right? Hardware, fiber, it takes time, it's expensive, you got to go through procurement, all that stuff, right? Our view is go after the stuff that's the things that you can achieve in those environments without new infrastructure. I can harden configs without new infrastructure. I can do account management without new infrastructure. I can start removing software tomorrow. There's a lot of things that you can do at the endpoint, particularly. I can harden my network configurations. I can, tighten up my ACLs. Lots of things I can do tomorrow. So that's the second dimension. And then the third dimension of this is pick off the things that get you large swaths of coverage. With the first, as you start to think about infrastructure, think about things that get you large swaths. So what I mean by that is, right, if you don't have perimeter security, start with that, because it creates one big barrier. As some people say, right, the M&M is hard on the outside, soft in the middle. At least you get that, and it gives you a wide swath of things. So those are our 3 ways of thinking about, okay, once you've got that assess, remediate, maintain, where do you start to begin that roadmap of putting together remediation plans? Another question was, what is the best checklist to use? So we've talked about CISA's checklist. It's a really good, consistent checklist. Now, it's not a framework, right? It's not like NIST, it's not IEC 62443, which are much more detailed in what they recommend you doing, but it gives you a checklist is probably the best way of putting it. It's much more of a checklist than a framework. Our experience is that there are 2 ways that we've seen successful companies go at this. The first, we've seen a lot of success using the CIS, what used to be called the top 20 is now called the top 18. We've adapted that to OT or ICS. It's very, very effective because it gives you a prescriptive target, right? So CIS has a set of maturity levels with very detailed achievement scores to get to that level. Sometimes if you don't go with something that's prescriptive, you spend days, weeks, months debating, okay, what security level do I want to be at? CIS gives you that. And you sort of pick, okay, I'm going to do a 3 or I'm going to do a 2 or whatever it is. And it simplifies some of that debate sometimes. The other approach is to use IEC 62443 in combination. We've seen it mostly done in combination with the NIST CSF. So those are a couple of different frameworks that we've seen be effective in doing this. And then there was a question around CVEs and CVSS scores and what they mean and how they work. So what are they? So to begin with, when a vulnerability is published, a software or hardware vulnerability is published, it is put into what is referred to as the National Vulnerability Database. This is managed by NIST. By the way, MITRE also maintains one. And these are mostly global databases that are shared. And that is given a CVE number. A CVE number is a way of tracking that vulnerability. And the CVE will describe what is the vulnerability, what it's supposed to describe, what software versions or hardware versions it's relevant for, and then it should provide a range of remediations that you can take to remediate that risk. Sometimes it's a patch, sometimes there's no patch for it, but there's a configuration setting that you can make. A CVSS score is the score that NIST puts to the criticality of that risk. And it's a combination of things, and there's a lot of debate about the validity of CVSS scores in ICS, and that's a whole nother webinar. But basically the gist is, if it's a high score, if it goes up to 10, if it's close to 10, it's a really critical risk. If it's a 5 or a 6, it's a medium criticality risk. It's taking into account a range of information from the severity of what you could do to that asset. It also takes into account the ease of that vulnerability to exploit. And so there's a variety of factors that goes into that number. Like I said, there's some debate how accurate those are for OT, but look, we don't have any better right now on a consistent basis. And so it's a pretty good place to start your work. It's just not the place to end it. There's probably more thinking you'll want to do than just looking at CVSS.